Hello, this is Joe Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and welcome to the Academy's official podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. I have two special guests today on this special episode. I have, just from north of the border, my good friend Paul LeVay from Canada. And from across the pond, as they would like to say, I have Paul Sreenan. Paul is in Ireland and is a former president of the Academy. Gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. How are you guys doing?
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning. Yeah, sorry. Good morning, Joe. Great.
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah.
Doing well. Yeah.
Let's kick this off. We wanted to have some of our international fellows here on the podcast to get your perspective on what's happening in the world, the problems that America may be causing in the world with the upsetting of the rule of law. Let's begin with Davos and Donald Trump's speech there. How did that resonate with you, Paul?
Which Paul?
Oh,
yeah, about
goodness.
to say that. Yeah.
Let's start with you, Paul S.
Okay. It was very much overshadowed, I would say, by Mark Carney's speech. Mark Carney's speech was regarded as truly impressive and the sort of speech that one would have expected of a US president, perhaps back at the time of Eisenhower or President Kennedy. It was statesmanlike, it was strong, it gave good leadership, and I think it was widely admired, whereas President Trump's speech, was not well regarded, quite honestly, seemed to lack clarity. The erroneous or the erroneous references to Iceland instead of Greenland it just gave the impression that it wasn't clearly thought out.
Paul LeVay, when he talks about Mark Carney, who's the Prime Minister of Canada, fill us in with some of the things that Mark was saying when he was there in Davos.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I must I agree with Paul Sreenan and Mark Carney's speech that day made me proud to be Canadian. I think that, one of the questions that we talked about discussing today is what do the kinds of claims that your president have been making specifically about the territorial acquisition of Greenland? What does that mean for the rules-based order and especially for middle powers and smaller states? And I don't think I can do better justice to that question than summarizing some of the things that Mark Carney said in his speech at Davos. I mean, he talked about how the rules-based order was fading in favor of, as he put it, an international order where the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. He talked about how in the past Canada had relied on benevolent American hegemony for things like open sea lanes and a stable financial system and collective security, but that the feeling, and I must say I share it, is that kind of thing is gone. He called it a rupture in the international order, not a transition. And I think he's right about that. And then he spoke, Joe, about what that means for a country like Canada, where, the multilateral institutions that we really relied on.
You guys have been our friends for hundreds of years now, Paul.
Well, and we've relied on that friendship, and he was quite candid about speaking the truth. He said we have to speak the truth about these things, and he said Canada has to approach this with a values-based realism, and I liked it because he said there was two components. There's a principled component, and he reiterated our Canadian respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition against the use of force as keystones of international law on the one hand.
Let me stop you. Let me stop you there for a second.
Yeah, sure.
That takes me on the topic of Greenland and Trump's overtures towards America taking over Greenland, and how I want to know in Europe and in NATO, Paul Sreenan, how did that land when you have an American president making these types of statements against a NATO ally?
Well, I suppose there are two things. It's the idea in the first place and the manner in which it was pursued. Secondly, the idea is not a new one put on the table by President Trump for the first time during his second presidency. Certainly back in 1946, the United States raised the issue of purchasing Greenland in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and it was rejected by the Danish Parliament on the basis of the territorial integrity of Greenland and the right of the native population there to self-determination. And that situation was then accepted by the United States.
That was 80. That was 80 something years ago, Paul, and this is 80 years later, and I'll say the rhetoric and the tenor and tone of Donald Trump is a little different than it was back then in the 40s. This is 2026 now. We have what we have with this NATO alliance and Paul LeVay, I want to go back to what you were saying with the upsetting of the rules-based democracies that we have, and you have an American power who is, I'll use the term, flexing its power. And what are your thoughts on that, Paul LeVay?
Well, I think, Joe, we're lawyers, and in the academy we champion the protection of the rule of law. And so I think what we have to do here, what are the foundational principles of international law, and how should they be upheld? And to me, there are really sort of a couple of cornerstones. One are the provisions of the UN Charter, which you'll recall were put into place in the shadow of the most atrocious, unlawful territorial acquisitions we'd ever seen by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And that's Article 2, Sub 4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force in international relations. There are really only two exceptions: the self-defense and actions authorized by the UN Security Council. So it's an upsetting of that. But also, if you go back and look at how territory had been acquired historically otherwise, there was the purchase of territory historically. There's Louisiana purchase, the United States from France, and Alaska, the United States from Russia in the 19th century. But we're talking about a different era. That was still in the colonial era. What we have now is internationally recognized principles of the rights of people to self-determination. That kind of thing, where you can buy Alaska for 2 cents an acre, which was the price, is a thing of the past. And if you apply it specifically to Greenland, in 2007, I believe, the Danish Parliament adopted a law which had been ratified by a referendum in Greenland, recognizing the right of the Greenlandic people to self-determination. And so Denmark and Greenland have clearly, as a matter of law, recognized that that's who determines the fate of Greenland. And so buying a piece of ice for an empirical acquisition, it's just not a thing anymore in international law.
Paul Sreenan, what are you guys feeling there in Europe about the remarks that Trump keeps making about NATO and almost withdrawing from NATO? And I wonder if all of this was about his continued dislike and disdain for NATO.
Well, I just taking up on Paul's point, firstly, I think it's important that we be absolutely clear on this at the beginning. But under Article 2 of the UN Charter, any use of force or any threat of the use of force against Greenland is unlawful and contrary to international law. And undoubtedly, in the context of NATO, this is one NATO member essentially threatening another. Territorial integrity of the members of NATO is one of the foundational principles of the NATO treaty. Under Article 5, it raises the issue. If there was to be an attack by the United States on Greenland, all of the NATO member states are expected to come to the assistance of Denmark.
Paul, what the hell does that mean? Does that mean we're going to be, we would be at war with Ireland, France, England? I mean, just continue on through all
and us too, Joe.
Yes, and Canada. What does that really mean?
Conceptually, you can see how wrong this all is and how it contravenes the assumptions that underlie, for example, the NATO treaty. But in Europe, and I suppose it's more a political question than a legal question that you asked me, Joe, in Europe, this is seen as part of a continuing attack, not just on NATO, but on the European Union. And you just question whether or not the timing of this is coincidental. In February of 2025, Greenland in its own right became a full member state of the European Union. And before that, it was an overseas territory, essentially, with an association agreement. But it is now part of the EU. And going back to what I mentioned about 1946, I mean, the issue was solved then by way of cooperation agreements and the United States being allowed to base its military in Greenland by entering into other cooperation agreements. For example, you have the Arctic Council that the United States is a member of, where all of the nations that are concerned with the Arctic, including Canada, and indeed, I believe Russia is a member of it, speak together and try to deal with these matters in a cooperative way. And these are grounding principles of international law now since the mid-1940s, the Pacific settlement of disputes and cooperation with each other, that you just can't grab something because you like it or because you think it might be to your advantage. And we talk about things having changed in the past 80 years since then. But up until recently, the change has all been in one direction. The prohibition on the use of force. There have been exceptions, of course, but the prohibition of the use of force or the threat of the use of force, that this is absolutely unacceptable. The submission of disputes to international bodies. The United States has not been one of the greatest adherents to submitting disputes to the determination of international bodies. The United States is not a member of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It withdrew from the compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court following the Nicaragua case. But
in that same vein, what has happened recently in Venezuela, and we can all agree that the Venezuelan government was corrupt. How has that action, Paul Levain, you guys are our closest neighbor, how has that played in Canada with what is, by all serious commentators, a violation of the international rules of law?
Well, it was an astounding event in a bad way for us, and it added an additional layer of worry to what we see going on south of the border. I mean, going into
when you say south of the border, you mean us here?
South of my border. South of my border. I agree with you that there's a consensus on President Maduro being a bad actor, but that can't give license to a country to go in and remove a head of state by force. And it's the worst kind of a slippery slope, and again, a breach of international law. But just coming back to NATO and Article 5 for a moment, Joe, just because I wanted to add a complimentary piece to what Paul said, with which I agree entirely. And it at least in Canada, perhaps in Ireland as well, it all of what's happening resonates particularly badly because Canada answered the bell on Article 5 after 9/11 and sent at the United States' instance and following proper international resolutions, sent our troops to Afghanistan to fight side by side with the Americans. And we lost 148 servicemen. Hundreds more were injured, which for Canada was an incredible thing. There was remember my country home is near a highway where the bodies of the servicemen would be brought for autopsy, and people would stop on the highway and salute. And about a couple of weeks ago, your president denigrated the participation of Canada in that exercise. He was asked about it, and he said, "Oh, well, the Canadians didn't do very much." And our servicemen are speaking up in the media about how angry and hurt they are about that. Those kinds of things, I hate to say it, are really, unduly terrible for our relationship with who we thought was our closest friend.
Well,
but
go ahead, Paul. Go ahead, Paul. Paul Sreenan.
Just to follow up on that, Denmark participated in that alliance in Afghanistan as well,
and they lost soldiers in the Afghan war too.
They did, and they lost proportionately more soldiers per head of population in the Afghan war than the United States did. And recently we've seen in the past week the US administration denigrating the Kingdom of Denmark and describing it as an irrelevance. In terms of the rule of law, the Kingdom of Denmark has consistently ranked number one of the nations in the world for respect for the rule of law. And in 2025, the United States came in 27th.
These actions by the American government and the rhetoric of Trump, what is that doing from your perspective to upset the rule of law as we move forward? Because again, understand we're only a year and a week into this chaos. Is this something that's going to be repairable, or have we forever lost, one, our standing, and two, fractured relationships that may not be repairable? I was particularly concerned when you heard Mark Carney talk about the countries like Canada, countries like Denmark, countries like yours, Paul, Ireland, realizing they're going to have to go on their own. Is this repairable? This is to either one of you guys to talk about.
Well, let me maybe address it really quickly. Mr. Carney spoke in his speech about how the middle powers have, and include Ireland in that, and Canada have, and the European Union countries have to come together to sort of find alliances and reassert our principles. I think that we have to calibrate our relationships based upon the behavior of our friends, not history. I think that was a big part of his message. But at the end of his message, what I particularly liked was he was positive. He said, and I quote, "We believe that from the fracture we can build something better, stronger, and more just." And I like that because it echoed a Leonard Cohen lyric that I really like.
But Paul, I took that the other way, though. I took that the wrong way. Not the wrong way. I took it a different way. I took it as him saying that the middle powers will build together separate from the United States.
Well, I think I took it, I guess, as a Canadian, as yes, that way, but also it depends on, the United States behavior going forward. What I think is clear, Joe, to your point, is we in Canada in particular have been very economically dependent on our relationship, and especially our trading and security relationships with the United States. We in Canada no longer feel we can have the same reliance we've had in the past. I don't know that that's coming back.
Paul, how has this landed over in Europe?
I think it's undermined our confidence in the United States as a trusted partner We've always looked to the United States as being a trusted partner, one of the great superpowers with which we were aligned in terms of our values, our economic outlook. And it's come at a particularly bad time because it's come at a time when we saw a serious assault on the world rules-based order and a breach of Article 2 of the UN Convention, and when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we saw the United States properly condemn that invasion, call it out indeed before it happened. And then within a few years, we find that the United States is threatening to do much the same. So we have great uncertainty, and we're concerned that that uncertainty is part of a deliberate undermining of both NATO and the European Union, and a giving of the green light to the Russian Federation to attack the Baltic states. So it's a matter of very, very real concern. And we certainly don't personalize it, I must say, in terms of just identifying all of this with President Trump. President Trump, like President Putin, is the front man of a large group of people. And there are clearly people such as the Vice President of the United States who are similarly minded. And we can't forget the fact that these people were voted in by the people of the United States.
So you're not then what I hear from you is that you don't look at this as a Trump problem. You look at this as an American problem. This is representing the thoughts of many Americans by us having elected him. Is that what you're saying, Paul Sreenan?
Yes, I mean, if President Trump was to leave the scene tomorrow, it's not going to solve the problem. There are others there who sing the same song and pursue the same agenda.
What I'd add to that, Joe, is look, obviously, we know that America is not a monolith on that. Far from it. We have friends like you and other friends in the academy, and we look at what's happening in Minneapolis at the moment and many, many other examples. But at the end of the day, certainly in a democracy, and I would count this as true for Canada, we're collectively responsible for the government we have. Right. That's why I like the former President Obama's focus on getting people out to vote and be active in the democratic system. That's a collective responsibility. I agree with Paul.
Yeah.
Paul Sreenan, go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul.
You might ask that. How would Europe react if a European country had its leader behaving in this way? And I can only speak for Ireland and perhaps to some extent the United Kingdom, with which I'm familiar. But people would be out in the streets protesting it, and the elected members of Parliament would be immediately reactive to the sentiment of the ordinary people out in the street, not the sentiment of big corporations, but the ordinary voters. And ultimately, there'd be a vote of no confidence in the leader, which would bring down the government.
Agreed.
And you don't see in America the widespread protests that you would expect. Is it from your perspective that we've grown too comfortable with our democracy and with the rule of law here in America? What's your sense, again, from the outside looking in?
Well, could I respond to that by saying that I don't necessarily agree with the premise of the question, Joe? We would look and we would see that there's a substantial proportion of people in the United States who are prepared to oppose government policy. For example, we've seen significant protests against US government policy in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war. We've seen significant protests in relation to ICE. Which significantly, from our perspective,
is that being covered in the European and Canadian press? Those people who are disagreeing, whether it's what's happening in Minnesota, whether it's what's happening in Ukraine, or even some of the Supreme Court decisions, is that news making it north of the border and across the Atlantic?
Your country is prominent in our news every day. I can tell you that, including those things. And look, we also, to add to Paul's point, we've also seen the reporting on the public opinion polls in the United States about annexing Greenland, and even a healthy majority of Republicans oppose it. So we know that the American people aren't a monolith favoring these things. I guess the thing that makes us a little bit nervous in Canada is history. I mean, we know there was Manifest Destiny, there was the Monroe Doctrine, now apparently the Donroe Doctrine.
I don't even think he understands what the Monroe Doctrine actually was.
He doesn't. But I mean, we're, as I think it was Pierre Trudeau said, sort of a mouse sleeping next to an elephant.
Yes.
And that elephant has historically had territorial ambition. And so I think that's what makes us in Canada concerned.
What about over there, Paul Sreenan?
Well, we're concerned with the way politics in the United States is working as well. And
talk to me about that. What do you mean?
And the extent to which big corporations seem to be able to control government rather than government responding to the needs of individual people. And we're also concerned with what we see as a replaying of historically the way President Putin seized absolute power in Russia, whereby the Duma was isolated and neutralized, and the judiciary was captured and was no longer independent. So we've seen these changes and how absolute power was accumulated there, and we can see the same things happening here with the neutralization of Congress, with attacks on the judiciary.
Not just attacks on the judiciary. Some would have you believe that the Supreme Court has emboldened Donald Trump with some of the things that he's been doing, with the things such as immunity for acts, while he was president. And I don't know whether you two followed the Jack Smith testimony yesterday.
I didn't, Joe.
I just saw a highlight of it, Joe. But just to pick up on Paul's point a little bit, I mean, I agree with him. The difference, I think, between the United States and Russia, and there are many, is the far more robust history of strong democratic institutions in the United States. Russia has never had that. The United States has had that. And so on the one hand, one might argue you can be—
I'm going to interrupt you, Paul, but yeah. Aren't you concerned, or at least I'm concerned, about the creep that's going on, the slow erosion of these long-standing traditions, values, and institutions? I'm sure you're aware of some of the politically motivated Justice Department investigations.
Yeah, no, well, that's where I was coming to. Is on the one hand, one might be reassured that the United States isn't Russia, but on the other hand, these bedrock institutions that we'd always been taught the United States has, and including a system of checks and balances in a democracy that, frankly, is laudable. I mean, one small example: in Canada, the Prime Minister can essentially declare war. In the United States, it requires the check of Congress declaring war in but the president being the commander in chief. So you have those kinds of structures. But you're right; they're being eroded before our very eyes, and I agree, that is quite worrisome. It's also, though, a threat to the prosperity of the United States. I mean, my good friend and the incoming Academy Dean Brian Gover always likes to quote Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. He's got a real Nobel, by the way.
He doesn't have a soccer Nobel.
No, but he's done a lot of empirical studies that equate the strength of the rule of law with the prosperity of economies. And the data is really quite astounding. And so if Americans took a step back and thought about that and about their own pocketbook, it would be another reason to fight for these institutions to make sure they don't erode and fade away.
Yeah. Paul Sreenan, what are you seeing from, again, your perspective about those institutions, those American institutions, which we had placed such great faith in to be part of the checks and balances that we've grown accustomed to and almost taken for granted?
Well, they don't seem to be working at present. And what we seem to have now in the United States is a king, a person with almost absolute power, and that is perceived to be somebody that people have to bend the knee to,
or deliver an airplane to, or buy bitcoins,
or give expensive gifts to in order to get what they want. And he's basically unconstrained or largely unconstrained in his power. He can threaten tariffs against allies. He can destroy relationships that have taken decades for the United States to build up internationally. And Congress is essentially not to be heard. Greenland is perhaps a minor exception in recent times, but it's a result, no doubt, because of extensive lobbying by the European Union of the members of Congress on that issue. They've suddenly woken up and decided to do something about it. And as for the United States Supreme Court, we find it difficult to understand the immunity that has been accorded to the president, because fundamental to the rule of law as it developed in recent times in England with Magna Carta is that nobody should be above the law. And the king, too, should be subject to the law. And Magna Carta came about because the king was unconstrained by law. We seem to see the same thing here. We can't understand the rationale for exempting or the president or giving him immunity.
Well, and the consequences of that, sorry, Joe, just a quick point. The consequences of that are quite far-reaching, including under international law. I mean, I was reading the other day from the opening statement that Robert Jackson, the great American jurist, went on to become a U.S. Supreme Court judge, but who was the prosecutor at Nuremberg, from his opening statement in Nuremberg. And he listed a number of examples of Nazi leaders flouting international law, just basically saying it doesn't apply to me, I decide what the law is. And he said the consequence of that is that you can't, if that's the attitude you take, you can't then seek to rely on the protections of the law. And I'm not drawing that analogy for any reason other than to make that point, right? You can't say international law doesn't matter to me, my own morality is my own guide, and then later, at a later point, seek the protection of the law.
And if we're depending on Trump's morality as the guide for America, we are all in trouble, and the world is in trouble, because we know his moral compass points always to the money and to power.
Yeah, and also, Joe, there's a lack of depth of knowledge of history, and that one
lack of depth of knowledge. He has no knowledge of history. I mean, you look at a man who denigrates troops, and you have a legacy of a family that has never served in the American service. They don't know what it is to do what service is. So that's in his genes, never to have done public service for public good. His father, his grandfather, he talks about his Aryan background in America, but none of those members in his family can he point to and say that I lost this uncle, I lost his aunt in World War II, World War I, the Korean or Vietnam War. They don't know what true sacrifice and service means. And I think that speaks to a lot of his values that we're seeing in full display. It's transactional.
But my comment, I suppose, Joe, was not so much directed to President Trump himself as to senior politicians in the United States who are in power now and in recent times. They seem to lack that depth of knowledge of history, whereas, Europe in a sense, is more steeped in history, and we can see the consequences of historical decisions made hundreds of years ago all around us. And we're very conscious of the fact that 500, 600, 700 years ago, the wealth of nations was squandered by powerful leaders who decided to take umbrage at some minor matter, pay with the cost of thousands of lives of their own citizens, squander the wealth of their nation. And it goes back to Paul McVeigh's point. All of these things, the uncertainty in relation to tariffs, they all have economic consequences, and the United States will be poorer as a result. I cannot understand the necessity for what President Trump has done in relation to Greenland. The United States already has a network of significant agreements that protects all of its relevant interests in the Arctic, as far as I can see, in terms of military bases, the opportunity of stationing equipment there to provide early warning systems, the protection of shipping lanes, economic access. It's totally unnecessary to have attacked allies in this way and to damage the trust which is fundamental to cooperative arrangements like that in the interests of defense, but also in the interests of the prosperity of the world.
Agreed. I mean, it's all of this, I think, was nicely summed up in terms of the ultimate potential consequences for the United States if this behavior continues, again, by another line from Mr. Carney's speech. And I listened to it initially, but Joe, I thank you for the invitation today, because I read it again top to bottom, and it's a great read. But here's what Mr. Carney said. And there's another truth. If great powers abandon even the pretense of rules and values for the unhindered pursuit of their power and interests, the gains from transactionalism will become harder to replicate. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships.
Paul LeVay, I'm going to end with you quoting Mark Carney. I want to thank you too for being with me today and for helping to inform the listeners on what is happening to America's status throughout the world. And I appreciate you too. Again, I'm Joe Tucker. This is The Rule of Law. The Academy speaks. Thank you for listening. Take care.